John Chrysostom, c. 349–407, Archbishop of Constantinople, was an important early church father. He is known for his preaching and public speaking, his denunciation of abusive authority by both ecclesiastical and political leaders, the Divine Liturgy of St. John Chrysostom, and his ascetic sensibilities. The epithet Inanawat II Florin II Florin II 1/4 II means golden-mouthed in Greek and was given on account of his legendary eloquence. The Orthodox and Eastern Catholic churches honor him as a saint and count him among the three holy hierarchs, together with Basil the Great and Gregory Nazianzus. He is recognized by the Eastern Orthodox Church and the Catholic Church as a saint and as a doctor of the Church. Churches of the Western tradition, including the Roman Catholic Church, some Anglican provinces, and parts of the Lutheran Church, commemorate him on September 13. Some Lutheran and many Anglican provinces commemorate him on the traditional Eastern feast day of January 27. The Coptic Orthodox Church of Alexandria also recognizes John Chrysostom as a saint. Among his homilies, 8 directed against Judaizing Christians are considered by some to have had an impact on the development of Christian antisemitism. Biography, early life and education. John was born in Antioch in 349 to Greco-Syrian parents. Different scholars describe his mother Anthissa as a pagan or as a Christian, and his father was a high-ranking military officer. John's father died soon after his birth and he was raised by his mother. He was baptized in 368 or 373 and tonsured as a reader. As a result of his mother's influential connections in the city, John began his education under the pagan teacher Libanius. From Libanius, John acquired the skills for a career in rhetoric, as well as a love of the Greek language and literature. As he grew older, however, he became more deeply committed to Christianity and went on to study theology under Diodor of Tarsus, founder of the reconstituted School of Antioch. According to the Christian historian Susimin, Libanius was supposed to have said on his deathbed that John would have been his successor if the Christians had not taken him from us. He lived in extreme asceticism and became a hermit in about 375. He spent the next 2 years continually standing, scarcely sleeping, and committing the Bible to memory. As a consequence of these practices, his stomach and kidneys were permanently damaged and poor health forced him to return to Antioch. Diaconate and service in Antioch. John was ordained as a deacon in 381 by Saint Meletius of Antioch, who was not then in communion with Alexandria and Rome. After the death of Meletius, John separated himself from the followers of Meletius, without joining Paulinus, the rival of Meletius for the bishopric of Antioch. But after the death of Paulinus he was ordained a presbyter in 386 by Evagrius, the successor of Paulinus. He was destined later to bring about reconciliation between Flavian I of Antioch, the successor of Alexandria and Rome, thus bringing those three sees into communion for the first time in nearly 70 years. In Antioch, over the course of 12 years, John gained popularity because of the eloquence of his public speaking at the Golden Church, Antioch's cathedral, especially his insightful expositions of Bible passages and moral teaching. The most valuable of his works from this period are his homilies on various books of the Bible. He emphasized charitable giving and was concerned with the spiritual and temporal needs of the poor. He also spoke against abuse of wealth and personal property. Do you wish to honor the body of Christ? Do not ignore him when he is naked. Do not pay him homage in the temple clad in silk, only then to neglect him outside where he is cold and ill-clad. He who said, "This is my body," is the same who said, "You saw me hungry and you gave me no food," and, "Whatever you did to the least of my brothers you did also to me." What good is it if the Eucharistic table is overloaded with golden chalices when your brother is dying of hunger? Start by satisfying his hunger and then with what is left you may adorn the altar as well. His straightforward understanding of the scriptures in contrast to the Alexandrian tendency towards allegorical interpretation meant that the themes of his talks were practical, explaining the Bible's application to everyday life. Such straightforward preaching helped Chrysostom to garner popular support. He founded a series of hospitals in Constantinople to care for the poor. One incident that happened during his service in Antioch illustrates the influence of his homilies. When Chrysostom arrived in Antioch, the bishop of the city had to intervene with Emperor Theodosius I on behalf of citizens who had gone on a rampage mutilating statues of the emperor and his family. During the weeks of Lent in 387, John preached 21 homilies in which he entreated the people to see the error of their ways. These made a lasting impression on the general population of the city. Many pagans converted to Christianity as a result of the homilies. As a result, Theodosius' vengeance was not as severe as it might have been. Archbishop of Constantinople, in the autumn of 397, John was appointed Archbishop of Constantinople, after having been nominated without his knowledge by the eunuch Eutropius. He had to leave Antioch in secret due to fears that the departure of such a popular figure would cause civil unrest. During his time as archbishop he adamantly refused to host lavish social gatherings, which made him popular with the common people, but unpopular with wealthy citizens and the clergy. His reforms of the clergy were also unpopular with these groups. He told visiting regional preachers to return to the churches they were meant to be serving without any payout. His time in Constantinople was more tumultuous than his time in Antioch. Theophilus, the Patriarch of Alexandria, wanted to bring Constantinople under his sway and opposed John's appointment to Constantinople. Theophilus had disciplined 4 Egyptian monks over their support of Origen's teachings. They fled to John and were welcomed by him. Theophilus therefore accused John of being too partial to the teaching of Origen. He made another enemy in Eudoxia, the wife of the Eastern Emperor Arcadius, who assumed that his denunciations of extravagance in feminine dress were aimed at herself. Eudoxia, Theophilus and other of his enemies held a synod in 403 to charge John, in which his connection to Origen was used against him. It resulted in his deposition and banishment. He was called back by Arcadius almost immediately, as the people became tumultuous over his departure. There was also an earthquake the night of his arrest, which Eudoxia took for a sign of God's anger, prompting her to ask Arcadius for John's reinstatement. Peace was short-lived. A silver statue of Eudoxia was erected in the Augusteion, near his cathedral. John denounced the dedication ceremonies. He spoke against her in harsh terms. Again Herodias raves. Again she is troubled. She dances again. And again desires to receive John's head in a charger, an allusion to the events surrounding the death of John the Baptist. Once again he was banished, this time to the Caucasus in Abkhazia. Around 405, Chrysostom began to lend moral and financial support to Christian monks who were enforcing the emperor's anti-pagan laws, by destroying temples and shrines in Phoenicia and nearby regions. Death and canonization. Faced with exile, John Chrysostom wrote an appeal for help to 3 churchmen, Pope Innocent I, the Bishop of Milan, Venerius, and the third to the Bishop of Aquileia, Chromatius. Pope Innocent I protested John's banishment out of Constantinople to the town of Caucasus in Cappadocia, but to no avail. Innocent sent a delegation to intercede on behalf of John in 405. It was led by Gaudentius of Brescia. Gaudentius and his companions, 2 bishops, encountered many difficulties and never reached their goal of entering Constantinople. John wrote letters which still held great influence in Constantinople. As a result of this, he was further exiled from the Caucasus to Pitound, where his tomb is a shrine for pilgrims. He never reached this destination, though, as he died at Cormana in Pontus on September 14, 407 during the journey. His last words are said to have been, III 3/4 I plus or minus I micro I euro I 1/2 I per mil I 1/2 or 1/4 I 1/2 I micron I micron I 1/2. John came to be venerated as a saint soon after his death. 3 decades later, some of his adherents in Constantinople remained in schism. Saint Proclus, Patriarch of Constantinople, hoping to bring about the reconciliation of these Johannites, preached a homily praising his predecessor in the Church of Hagia Sophia. He said, "O John, your life was filled with sorrow, but your death was glorious. Your grave is blessed and reward is great, by the grace and mercy of our Lord Jesus Christ, O graced one, having conquered the bounds of time and place. Love has conquered space, unforgetting memory has annihilated the limits, and place does not hinder the miracles of the saint. These homilies helped to mobilize public opinion, and the Patriarch received permission from the emperor to return Chrysostom's relics to Constantinople, where they were enshrined in the Church of the Holy Apostles on January 28, 438. The Eastern Orthodox Church commemorates him as a great ecumenical teacher, together with Basil the Great and Gregory the Theologian. These three saints, in addition to having their own individual commemorations throughout the year, are commemorated together on January 30, a feast known as the Synixis of the Three Hierarchs. There are several feast days dedicated to him: January 27, translation of the relics of St. John Chrysostom from Comana to Constantinople; January 30, Synixis of the Three Great Hierarchs; September 14, repose of St. John Chrysostom; November 13, St. John Chrysostom the Archbishop of Constantinople. Writings, homilies, Paschal Homily. The best known of his many homilies, his famous Paschal Homily, is rather brief. In the Eastern Orthodox Church it is traditionally read in full each year at the Paschal Divine Liturgy service following the Midnight Orthros. General, known as the greatest preacher in the early Church, John's homilies have been one of his greatest lasting legacies. Chrysostom's extant homiletical works are vast, including many hundreds of exegetical homilies on both the New Testament and the Old Testament. Among his extant exegetical works are 67 homilies on Genesis, 59 on the Psalms, 90 on the Gospel of Matthew, 88 on the Gospel of John, and 55 on the Acts of the Apostles. The homilies were written down by stenographers and subsequently circulated, revealing a style that tended to be direct and greatly personal, but was also formed by the rhetorical conventions of his time and place. In general, his homiletical theology displays much characteristic of the Antiocian school, but he also uses a good deal of the allegorical interpretation more associated with the Alexandrian school. John's social and religious world was formed by the continuing and pervasive presence of paganism in the life of the city. One of his regular topics was the paganism in the culture of Constantinople, and in his homilies he thunders against popular pagan amusements, the theatre, horse races, and the revelry surrounding holidays. In particular, he criticized Christians for taking part in such activities. If you ask Christians who was Amos or Obadiah, how many apostles there were or prophets, they stand mute. But if you ask them about the horses or drivers, they answer with more solemnity than sophists or tis. John's homilies on St. Paul's epistles proceed linearly, methodically treating the texts verse by verse, often going into great detail. He shows a concern to be understood by laypeople, sometimes offering colorful analogies and practical examples. At other times, he offers extended comments clearly intended to address the theological subtleties of a heretical misreading, or to demonstrate the presence of a deeper theme. One of the recurring features of John's homilies is his emphasis on care for the needy. Echoing themes found in the Gospel of Matthew, he calls upon the rich to lay aside materialism in favor of helping the poor, often employing all of his rhetorical skills to shame wealthy people to abandon conspicuous consumption. Do you pay such honor to your excrements as to receive them into a silver chamber pot when another man made in the image of God is perishing in the cold? Homilies on Jews and Judaizing Christians. During his first 2 years as a presbyter in Antioch, John denounced Jews and Judaizing Christians in a series of 8 homilies delivered to Christians in his congregation who were taking part in Jewish festivals and other Jewish observances. It is disputed whether the main target was specifically Judaizers or Jews in general. His homilies were expressed in the conventional manner, utilizing the uncompromising rhetorical form known as the psogos. One of the purposes of these homilies was to prevent Christians from participating in Jewish customs, and thus prevent the perceived erosion of Chrysostom's flock. In his homilies, John criticized those Judaizing Christians, who were participating in Jewish festivals and taking part in other Jewish observances, such as the Shabbat, submitted to circumcision and made pilgrimage to Jewish holy places. John claimed that on the Shabbats and Jewish festivals synagogues were full of Christians, especially women, who loved the solemnity of the Jewish liturgy, enjoyed listening to the shofar on Rosh Hashanah, and applauded famous preachers in accordance with the contemporary custom. A more recent theory is that he instead tried to persuade Jewish Christians, who for centuries had kept connections with Jews and Judaism, to choose between Judaism and Christianity. In Greek the homilies are called kataiodion, which is translated as Adversus Judaeos in Latin and Against the Jews in English. The original Benedictine editor of the homilies, Bernard de Montfaucon, gives the following footnote to the title, A Discourse Against the Jews. But it was delivered against those who were Judaizing and keeping the fasts with them, the Jews. According to patristic scholars, opposition to any particular view during the late 4th century was conventionally expressed in a manner, utilizing the rhetorical form known as the pseugos, whose literary conventions were to vilify opponents in an uncompromising manner. Thus, it has been argued that to call Chrysostom an anti-Semite is to employ anachronistic terminology in a way incongruous with historical context and record. That does not, however, prevent one from claiming that Chrysostom's theology was a form of anti-Jewish supersessionism, or that his rhetoric was not anti-Judaism. Treatises. Apart from his homilies, a number of John's other treatises have had a lasting influence. One such work is John's early treatise against those who opposed the monastic life, written while he was a deacon, which was directed to parents, pagan as well as Christian, whose sons were contemplating a monastic vocation. The book is a sharp attack on the values of Anglican upper-class urban society written by someone who was a member of that class. Chrysostom also writes that, already in his day, it was customary for Anglicans to send their sons to be educated by monks. Other important treatises written by John include On the Priesthood, Instructions to Catechumens, and On the Incomprehensibility of the Divine Nature. In addition, he wrote a series of letters to the Deaconess Olympias, of which 17 are extant. Liturgy. Beyond his preaching, the other lasting legacy of John is his influence on Christian liturgy. Two of his writings are particularly notable. He harmonized the liturgical life of the Church by revising the prayers and rubrics of the Divine Liturgy, or celebration of the Holy Eucharist. To this day, Eastern Orthodox and Eastern Catholic churches of the Byzantine Rite typically celebrate the Divine Liturgy of St. John Chrysostom as the normal Eucharistic liturgy, although his exact connection with it remains a matter of debate among experts. Legacy and influence. During a time when city clergy was subject to criticism for their high lifestyle, John was determined to reform his clergy in Constantinople. These efforts were met with resistance and limited success. He was an excellent preacher whose homilies and writings are still studied and quoted. As a theologian, he has been and continues to be very important in Eastern Christianity, and is generally considered the most prominent doctor of the Greek Church, but has been less important to Western Christianity. His writings have survived to the present day more so than any of the other Greek fathers. He rejected the contemporary trend for allegory, instead speaking plainly and applying Bible passages and lessons to everyday life. His exile demonstrated the rivalry between Constantinople and Alexandria for recognition as the preeminent Eastern see, while in the West, the Pope's primacy remained unquestioned. Influence on the Catechism of the Catholic Church and clergy. John's influence on church teachings is interwoven throughout the current Catechism of the Catholic Church. The Catechism cites him in 18 sections, particularly his reflections on the purpose of prayer and the meaning of the Lord's Prayer. Consider how Jesus Christ teaches us to be humble, by making us see that our virtue does not depend on our work alone but on grace from on high. He commands each of the faithful who prays to do so universally, for the whole world. For he did not say thy will be done in me or in us, but on earth, the whole earth, so that error may be banished from it, truth take root in it, all vice be destroyed on it, virtue flourish on it, and earth no longer differ from heaven. Christian clerics, such as Arestor, refer to him as one of the most eloquent preachers who ever since apostolic times have brought to men the divine tidings of truth and love, and the 19th century John Henry Newman described John as a bright, cheerful, gentle soul. A sensitive heart. Music and literature. John's liturgical legacy has inspired several musical compositions. Particularly noteworthy are Sergei Rachmaninoff's Liturgy of St. John Chrysostom, Op. 31, composed in 1910, one of his two major unaccompanied choral works. Piotr Tchaikovsky's Liturgy of St. John Chrysostom, Op. 41. And Ukrainian composer Kyrylo Stetsenko's Liturgy of St. John Chrysostom. Also noteworthy is the Divine Liturgy of St. John Chrysostom by the Serbian composer Stevan Mokranjac. Arvo Parkaranci Art's litany sets Chrysostom's 24 prayers, one for each hour of the day, for soli, mixed choir and orchestra. James Joyce's novel Ulysses includes a character named Mulligan who brings Chrysostomos into another character's mind because Mulligan's gold-stopped teeth and his gift of the gab earn him the title which St. John Chrysostom's preaching earned him. Golden-mouthed, Mulligan peered sideways up and gave a long low whistle of call, then paused a while in rapt attention, his even white teeth glistening here and there with gold points. Chrysostomos. The legend of the penance of St. John Chrysostom. A late medieval legend relates that, when John Chrysostom was a hermit in the desert, he was approached by a royal princess in distress. The saint, thinking she was a demon, at first refused to help her, but the princess convinced him that she was a Christian and would be devoured by wild beasts if she were not allowed to enter his cave. He therefore admitted her, carefully dividing the cave in two parts, one for each of them. In spite of these precautions, the sin of fornication was committed, and in an attempt to hide it, the distraught saint took the princess and threw her over a precipice. He then went to Rome to beg absolution, which was refused. Realizing the appalling nature of his crimes, Chrysostom made a vow that he would never rise from the ground until his sins were expiated, and for years he lived like a beast, crawling on all fours and feeding on wild grasses and roots. Subsequently the princess reappeared, alive, and suckling the saint's baby, who miraculously pronounced his sins forgiven. This last scene was very popular from the late 15th century onwards as a subject for engravers and artists. The theme was depicted by Albrecht Darwan Corterere around 1496, Hansbald Beum and Lucas Cranach the Elder, among others. Martin Luther mocked this same legend in his Die La one Quarter Gen von S. Johann Chrysostomo. The legend was also recorded in Croatia in the 16th century. Relics. John Chrysostom died in the city of Komana in the year 407 on his way to his place of exile. There his relics remained until 438 when, 30 years after his death, they were transferred to Constantinople during the reign of the Empress Eudoxia's son, the Emperor Theodosius II, under the guidance of John's disciple, Saint Proclus, who by that time had become Archbishop of Constantinople. Most of John's relics were looted from Constantinople by Crusaders in 1204 and taken to Rome, but some of his bones were returned to the Orthodox Church on November 27, 2004 by Pope John Paul II. They are now enshrined in the Church of St. George, Istanbul. However, the skull of St. John, having been kept at the Vitopedi Monastery on Mount Athos in northern Greece, was not among the relics that were taken by the Crusaders in the 13th century. In 1655, at the request of Tsar Alexei Mikhailovich, the skull was taken to Russia, for which the monastery was compensated in the sum of 2,000 rubles. In 1693, having received a request from the Vitopedi Monastery for the return of St. John's skull, Tsar Peter the Great ordered that the skull remain in Russia but that the monastery was to be paid 500 rubles every 4 years. The Russian state archives document these payments up until 1735. The skull was kept at the Moscow Kremlin, in the Cathedral of the Dormition of the Mother of God, until 1920, when it was confiscated by the Soviets and placed in the Museum of Silver Antiquities. In 1988, in connection with the 1000th anniversary of the baptism of Russia, the head, along with other important relics, was returned to the Russian Orthodox Church and kept at the Epiphany Cathedral, until being moved to the Cathedral of Christ the Saviour after its restoration. However, today, the Vitopedi Monastery posits a rival claim to possession of the skull of St. John Chrysostom, and their skull is venerated by pilgrims to the monastery as that of St. John. 2 places in Italy also claim to have the skull of St. John Chrysostom, the Basilica di Santa Maria del Fiore in Florence and the Dal Pozzo Chapel in Pisa. The right hand of St. John is preserved on Mount Athos, and numerous smaller relics are scattered throughout the world. Notes. References